Alrighty, everyone. Welcome back. This lecture is going to be just broadly on a one way or one perspective of looking at motivation, which is from an evolutionary and sociobiological approach. This is just basically getting at why we have certain motives that we have, and takes more biological approach to that. And so in this video here, what will be included is looking at responses. Well, first I'll start with just like a general quick overview, and then we'll get into how this applies to food selection, and additionally from this theory, how it explains various sex/reproduction behaviors. And then that will be the end of this video. So I'm going to split it into a couple parts. Yeah. So what is sociobiology? From this perspective, basically, researchers look at the relationship between evolution and biology, or sorry, evolution and behavior. So again, taking a biological approach to why we behave in certain ways and how that might be adaptive. So sociobiology is kind of like a really broad umbrella term that includes evolutionary psychology and then kind of adds to that. So with evolutionary psychology, it's talking about how psychological characteristics such as traits, intelligence, things like that, develop and evolve over time. And the guy in this picture is just Darwin, who is obviously, I mean, if you've taken just like a biology class, you've definitely heard of Darwin. Big name in the field. Also, maybe you've heard of someone named E.O. Wilson, who has also played a large role in sociobiology. And so with this perspective, it's getting at that there's a biological basis to social behavior and culture. So basically, we've evolved to have the various motivations that we have, and this biological evolution and how that kind of interacts with culture leads to how we act and how, what things we're motivated for. So main points are definitely survival and reproduction. That's the key part of this, is how, why are these things adaptive? Why are certain motivations? Why have these evolved? Why are they still here? And so just as you're going through all this, I think it's important to just consider how each of these behaviors or motivations based on this theory might be functional or adaptive. And this does kind of get at the never-ending nature versus nurture debate that psychologists have been arguing about forever and will probably consider or continue to argue about. And so obviously with an evolutionary perspective, this is going to take more of a nature approach, but we're going to talk about there definitely being some nurture aspects as well. So there are some people that are just strictly nature, like we come into this world just, ready to go because we've evolved this way. There are people who argue just nurture, like it's all your environment, all your culture. And then plenty of people argue that there's also just an interaction of both of these things. A very large part of this is fitness. And I don't mean like exercising fitness, I mean like genes, Darwinian type of fitness. So there are two main types. One is classic fitness, which is like what is good for you specifically, what is good for your own reproduction and your own survival. And then there's also inclusive fitness, which is more of like what is good for one's genes. So this is going to be broader. This is going to include the protection of family members who you share genes with, to try and keep those genes going. So Again, we're going to talk about the food aspect and the reproduction aspect from this perspective in the current video here. So starting with food, relatively quick section here, but I just want to cover a couple of things. So basically, we've come quite a long way over, tens and tens of thousands of years. I think we've always been more omnivorous, meaning we eat and have to eat really to be healthy. Many different types of foods, but we used to be more nomadic, which just means like moving around all the time, as opposed to now it's more typical to be settled in one area for longer periods of times. So we've evolved in that way. And so this is just a picture here of some hunters trying to get what I think is a giant armadillo, which is certainly extinct now. Kind of interestingly, if you look at the history of humanity, you can kind of tell where people have been based on which or how many of these large animals have been hunted to extinction. But relative to other animals, things that were and still are uniquely human are tools. Certainly some animals use tools like I think crows, for an example, will use like a little stick to kind of jab at things. But the main difference is that we keep our tools for a long time. So like an example would be, the spears in this picture. It's likely that those won't just be used once and then dropped. We keep those for a long time. Additionally, things like planning, cooperation, and communication can be thought of as, to an extent, uniquely human. Certainly there are animals that do this as well, but we do these things very well. And so what has changed? Again, we've gone from being nomadic and moving around all the time to setting up civilizations and set locations where we just stay for long periods of time. And this has also changed just how we eat, because this allowed for more farming, as you see in this bottom picture here. And there's evidence for things like written tax receipts from a long time ago, which obviously provides evidence of these types of civilizations that we have today. So yeah, basically in terms of food here, we've evolved from strictly like hunting, gathering as we travel and go to new places, to learning how to farm and survive in just one place. We have food preferences that seem to provide evidence for an evolutionary or kind of a social biological standpoint. A key example of this would be food neophobia. So we, even starting at a pretty young age, prefer the old foods that we've just been having as opposed to new foods, because, well, based on this theory, it would be because we have already eaten these old foods before, and therefore we know that they're safe. We know that they're not going to be poisonous, not going to hurt us, versus new foods, we can't be so sure about that. So yeah, with infants, they show a preference for sweet foods and an aversion to sour and bitter tastes. This also seems to be adaptive, because things like, those sugars, especially, a long time ago, were more difficult to find. And so they're really important to make sure that our bodies want that, and making sure that we know that we want that so that we get those sugars that we need, versus, the sour and bitter taste could potentially signal more like poisony types of things. And so infants, as talked briefly about in the book, will also just make faces when trying out these sour and bitter foods, and that can also be thought of as adaptive, because obviously, at a really young age, they can't be telling whoever's feeding them like, hey, I need more carbs today, so they make these disgusted faces or whatever when they try things that they don't like. And so the idea is that it's adaptive, that they don't like certain things. Similar idea with the fat preference, the preference for just fatty foods. And so again, back in the day, before farming and all that, it certainly was not easy to get all of the fatty foods that are needed for humans. And so interestingly today, definitely not everywhere, but in quite a few locations, they're not finding enough fatty foods is not the problem. Now, these things are really plentiful with, fast food places and all of that. And so it's kind of interesting how this has evolved where we still really crave it, but in many locations, it's not so much of a problem anymore to find it. So while these first few points give evidence for evolution, food preference also seems to be learned to an extent. So it's kind of a combination between evolution and then what we all learn about food, especially in our early days of life or existence. So there's a study in the book where this just gives evidence that food preference is learned. So they had mothers for the last couple months of pregnancy or a couple months after pregnancy give either drink carrot juice themselves or give their baby carrot juice. And this led to later on those babies or small children at that point ended up preferring carrot flavored cereal as opposed to the mothers who were just drinking and feeding with water. So that's interesting, and yeah, it gives evidence for the learning aspect of this. And I honestly didn't even know that there was carrot flavored cereal, so it's interesting. But yeah, that's it for the food part. Pretty quick section there. Getting into the reproduction aspect based on this theory. And so based on the biosocial theory of reproduction, this theorizes that there are biological differences between men and women in terms of strength and size and reproductive capacity, which we'll talk a little bit more, a couple slides here. And basically, based on this theory, there's an interaction between these biological differences and societal expectations, and that this creates sex relevant roles. And then this interaction and the creation of sex relevant roles will then increase psychological differences and things like parenting sometimes, as well as mate selection. So speaking of that parental investment, based on this theory, investment is typically much higher for women than men. First of all, just because that is to an extent just like a biological requirement, at least for 9 months, where women, when being pregnant, will just have to provide and give up more resources for that child during that time period. And so also based on this theory, men will just biologically have more variance in the number of children that they have just because they can. Obviously, men are not so limited in terms of, again, the woman will carry out that child for 9 months and during that time can't get pregnant again. But men can go around and get other people pregnant, try to make more children at that same time, which is where this theory is coming from in terms of men having a larger variance in terms of number of children than women. And then also, based on this theory, women are more discerning. So basically, this gets at kind of that fitness idea where men can kind of get at that fitness and the reproduction aspect of that by reproduction with many different women versus women are going to have to, again, invest more time and therefore they want it's wanted to make more of a good decision, one that's going to successfully pass on genes. Each partner is going to be more important for that for women, based on this theory. And so as you see here in the chart, this is just from 1990 to 2015, percentage of 2 or 1 parent households with children. You can see that the majority, both parents are playing some role in raising the children. But the main thing I want you to look at here is that when it is the 1 parent households, that seems to be almost exclusively the mother that's investing there. Obviously, that's not always the case, but percentage-wise, it does seem as though if there's 1 parent, that's more commonly the mother. So heterosexual mate value, again, based on this theory, there are biological differences that interact with various societal roles and cultural aspects that then in turn change what each sex looks for in a potential mate. So based on this theory, men are attracted to signals of fertility, like youth, health, and signals of youth and health, like a waist to hip ratio. Whereas women, based on this theory, are attracted to signals of social dominance, such as youth, but also maturity. This again gets at trying to find a mate who is also going to be who is going to stick around and also be invested in that child. That's where that maturity aspect comes from. Additionally, status and wealth and ambition, based on this theory, this would be to provide various resources for the women, especially that woman is pregnant. Interestingly, so there seems to be mixed evidence about the role of culture in this as well, but the general gist of this suggests that this is not just evolution, and that there is certainly quite a large cultural aspect to this as well. So a few examples of this, your book talks about gender sex equality. There's mixed evidence of this, where in one study that the book talks about, when women started, or when women were making more money and getting more equality based on that, the traits that are looked for in terms of that wealth or ambition aspect didn't change. However, a different study showed that it did, and showed that as gender sex equality increased and things got more equal, the differential and the traits that are looked at changed. So the women in general were less focused on looking on traits of like wealth and ambition and things like that when there was more equality in that culture or environment. Additionally, niceness and how important this seems to be varies across culture and environments. And so obviously, if there's only an evolutionary component to this for all of humanity, you wouldn't expect that to change based on culture. And finally, it appears that traits are changing in importance over time. Specifically, I think this study focused on that ambition aspect, and how women are starting to focus less on that, whereas men seem to focus on that just as much as they have in past years. So all this just to say, based on this theory, we'll see certainly evolutionary components to mate value, but culture seems to influence this as well. A pretty large aspect, if you read your book, well, it'll talk about this good gene hypothesis, which again, it's at that fitness where you're trying to find the best reproductive possibilities possible in terms of, yeah, survival of your children, survival of yourselves, resources, things like that. And so these faces are generally thought to be attractive across cultures, which provides evidence for the good gene hypothesis. And again, the idea is that the certain facial symmetry is going to signal health and good genes to pass on to future children. And again, your book will actually talk about the opposite of this too, where not only do we try to find what we believe to be good genes, we also try to typically, when talking about reproduction, stay away from what we perceive as being bad genes. So there's also a bad gene hypothesis, which is basically the opposite. And so, yeah, something to think about here is whether or not environment or culture influences mate selection, or whether this good gene hypothesis is the same everywhere and all humans look for the same things and potential partners and mates due to evolution. Some evidence here of a study that kind of supports the biosocial perspective of mate value and selection. So as you see in the graph here, we have various attributes such as being good looking and having a slender body versus a steady income and makes a lot of money. And we have men and women for each. And so based on this study, men look for more of a good looking mate with a slender body versus women look more for steady income and making a lot of money. Based on this theory, that would be to provide resources. However, as with a lot of evolutionary sociobiological aspects, it's relatively polarizing, and there's seems to be, for most aspects of this, there's evidence for both supports this theory and evidence that additionally does not. And so this is an example of a study that does not support the idea of the sociobiological perspective of how men and women differ in how they perceive mate value. And so this provides, again, just an example of an issue with this approach. And so based on the sociobiological theory or approach, women should be more interested in earning prospects. As we see in this table here on the right, that's not what we find. So we have males, females, and then we have physical attractiveness and earning prospects. It's basically what, based on this theory, you would expect to see would be a pattern where these correlations would be higher here for women and earning prospects, and that pattern is just not found here. And so, long story short, this was just a study based on, I won't go into it too much, but a study based on speed dating and what individuals reported just looking for in these speed dates. So finally here, last slide for this video, something that this theory or approach really does not focus on and does not study very much at all is same-sex mate value. And so, well, this theory is very limited when it comes to non-heterosexual sexual orientations. There does seem to be some evidence in what other sexual orientations tend to look for, although again, based on this theory, not a lot of studies cover this. But yeah, there is some evidence based on empirical research that homosexual men and women tend to prefer more masculine faces in a potential partner. So that is it for this section. So I'll stop the video here. Yeah, the next video we'll get into the social behaviors and psychological modules. There's a lot of kind of interacting aspects of this theory, and a lot of yeah, again, a lot of aspects of this are debated and have been debated for a very long time, especially for those, sex and reproductive differences that this theory looks for and perceives. And so your book definitely goes into more detail, so please be sure to read that. Certainly, I wanted to just give a few examples of how, both food and reproduction are looked at from this perspective. But yeah, your book will take it into a bit more detail, and definitely let me know if you have any questions or are interested in this topic or theory and want to have some more resources to look into this more. Yeah, thanks. Oops.